Hi there, and welcome to a new episode of Impact Talks. Today we have Marty Cagan with us. He's partner at Silicon Valley Product Group. He held executive product positions at eBay, Netscape, Continuus and HP, startups and Fortune 500 companies, responsible for business strategy, product strategy, and many others. He's also an author of 2 books. And I'm really excited to have him on. Marty, please tell the people where you're from and what you do.
Well, I'm from most of my life San Francisco Bay Area, California, and I have been in the tech industry my entire career since college, and then first jobs out of college was in the industry, and been doing it ever since. So I'm interested in all things related to product. That's a lot of engineering, design, and product management, and both the people who do it and the leaders of those organizations.
What did you study and what was your first job out of college?
I studied computer science, and my first 10 years in work were as a developer, as an engineer. And I worked at HP Labs. It was the applied research group of Hewlett Packard. And at the time, they were sort of the Google of the day. They were considered the most consistently innovative company, and I was encouraged to work there because it would be a good place to learn, and it really was a good place to learn.
What were some of the most interesting projects you were working on during that time at HP? I remember reading Steve Jobs' biography, and he pretty much said exactly what you said about HP at the time. So it must have been really exciting. What were some of the most interesting projects?
Yeah, it was actually his co-founder Wozniak that was also at HP during that same time, actually. And there's all kinds of crazy stories because Wozniak actually proposed to HP that they build the first, what became the Apple I. And HP said, oh no, there's no market for personal computers. We do things for scientists and stuff like that. So probably one of the biggest mistakes in the history of the industry. But I worked exclusively through that time on products for other developers. So I've always loved the software tool space. And so I did products for developers and product teams. So a lot of tools that are just basic tools like debuggers and source code analyzers, and then also team-oriented tools like configuration management tools and change management tools. But I was very interested in, like a lot of engineers, I was interested in tools for other engineers. It's still a great space.
How big was HP at the time, employee-wise? Was it, considering the location you were in, were you seeing Woz every day, or was it thousands of people at the time?
Oh, no. It was massive. In fact, I've never seen him in person. It was over 100,000 employees. HP was actually much bigger than it is today. Since those days, that was really the peak of HP. But since then, they split off all the instrument divisions, which was really half the company, people doing medical instruments and measurement instruments, which was also, I thought, a lot of the most interesting parts of the company. And then, of course, they brought in a bunch of leaders out of sort of the MBA style of leadership, and they ended up selling off most of the company. And it's just a shell of what it once was, unfortunately.
The way you sound, it sounds very much like when my team and I are speaking from that perspective of really passionate for the craft. I can completely imagine HP at the time really attracting people who are interested in the craft of engineering, designing, that kind of stuff. What do you think happened on leadership level? Do you think they should have had engineers in the leadership?
Well, short answer is yes. For, I don't even know how many, but more than 50 years. So certainly Dave Packard and Bill Hewlett, the co-founders, were engineers. And they had retired by the time I joined. It had already been a long company. And they is really the board of directors that's responsible for recruiting CEOs. And they had a series of very successful CEOs that had all come from an engineering background. And then, but most of them had also spent time in sales and other parts of the company, so they were very well-rounded. But then the board unfortunately decided that marketing was now going to be the most important thing. And they made some hiring decisions that, I think what fundamentally they were smart people, but they did not understand the engine of innovation. They did not understand what a technology product company was really about. And so it led to the beginning, it led to unfortunately, serious problems in the company.
You've been in the tech industry for a while, like you said. Do you feel like nowadays there are companies that are going through a similar issue? They're making these fundamental mistakes, stepping away from their engineering background, going into a marketing background, going into marketing?
That's always been true forever, and it probably always will be true. There are companies that understand this and thrive. Amazon is a great example. Google, to be honest, one of the most interesting and informative examples is actually Microsoft. And you could argue Apple too. Both Microsoft and Apple had a founder that was very committed to product. In the case of Microsoft, of course, Bill Gates. And then they both brought in leaders that replaced them that were from, in both cases, sales. And in both cases, they lost their mojo. Now, like in the case of Microsoft, I thought Ballmer was not a bad person, but he was a terrible leader, in my opinion, for a company like Microsoft. And we saw a 10, 15-year decline in Microsoft. In fact, I thought that was too far gone. But then the board ended up replacing Ballmer with Satya, who has been amazing. And it's been very impressive to see Microsoft turn around, which is, of course, what we saw with Apple, too. When Steve Jobs came back, Apple turned around from the brink of death. They were in far worse shape than Microsoft was. And today, Microsoft and Apple are two of the most valuable companies in the world. And they both had that near-death experience, or they lost this. So it happens all the time. And in my opinion, it stems from the board not understanding the role that technology needs to play in companies going forward.
How come it takes so long for the board to realize this? I mean, the examples you just gave, those are 10, 15-year spans that those CEOs kept their positions, and only then did somebody else come to save them.
Yeah, it's a hard question to say. I don't think there's a lot of accountability for board members. That's not really the process. And so it can be very difficult to get a board to do something if the outside investors think that it really needs to be done, but they don't agree. Especially because sometimes the controlling interest is with the members of the board, or even with, one of the founders. And so that is, it can be very difficult and take very long. And sometimes it never happens. The company dies.
True. I like what you said about Microsoft. We had somebody on from Microsoft, actually, and I literally said that on the podcast. I thought it was too far gone. And then this new CEO came and somehow switched it around. From your perspective, being, in San Francisco, having that product, that engineering background, what do you think they did to pretty much save it?
Microsoft?
Yeah, Microsoft.
No, it's simple. They picked a leader that was a product person. That's what they did. And he did a very good job at changing the culture of the company. I would argue back to its roots. back to more of what it really did well. Of course, it's a much larger company now. They've also done some I think, very intelligent acquisitions, and they were even smarter because they didn't ruin them like most companies do. After they acquired them, they have largely let those companies run the way they needed to run with the leaders that they had. And so, I think Microsoft is... I'm happy to say this too, because I was not optimistic about them, but I think they've done a really remarkable job turning around, and I am now rooting for them again.
Same here. I have to say we used to only use Windows, and then there was a point where we switched everything to Mac inside the company, and I've been happy to say that lately I've been looking back at Windows products, very interested. So yeah, very, very fun to hear that you're in the same boat. So after HP, do you feel like the motivation started going away because all these MBAs started getting into leadership? Is that why you left? What were your next steps and why did you take them?
No, I should say when I left, it was an awesome company and it didn't have any of these issues. It was afterwards. And I left because I was there 10 years and I wanted to do a startup. And so I started a company called Continuous Software Corporation, and I wanted to learn what it's like. And HP at the time, like I said, was huge, and I loved the idea of being a startup, and it was a great experience to do that. And so I recommend it to lots of people if they're up for it, for sure.
Can you tell me about those beginning steps? First of all, I always ask when people go from corporate to a startup, what gave you the courage to do it? When did you know it was the right moment to do so?
Well, I mean, it was kind of a funny part of the culture at HP, but when you're at HP, people there, it's not like a typical company today. People were there 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and I was there 10 years. And there was no rule that said if you stay past 10 years, you're going to spend your life there. But that's kind of how we thought of it. And so I was like, I'm not going to be a lifer. I want to go do other things. And so at the 10-year mark, I had mentally made up my mind. I wanted to go do a startup. And this was before the internet. This was just before the internet. So startups were not as common as they became pretty quickly. But the startup was in the software tool space. So I felt like I knew that space. I knew a lot of people. And I felt like there was a need. And so I also was young enough where I didn't worry about it too much. I felt like I could always get a normal job if I needed to.
Because at that point you were just over your 30s, right?
I had just turned 30.
Great. Do you think it was the 10 years and the fact that you turned 30 that it was time to take that risk?
I don't know. I'm not good at psychology, but so who knows? But I just felt like I wanted to do it, and it was good time to do it.
Did you get a co-founder, or did you get an early team, or was it just you at the beginning?
Yeah, no, there was a set of people and two amazing investors. That one became the CEO and one became the COO. I was the CTO and the head of product. And the two investors had done successful companies before, so they were serial entrepreneurs. And they started as investors, but then they became, we begged them to become the CEO and the CFO, really. And I learned a lot from those two serial entrepreneurs, a lot. And I'm very grateful to everything I learned. And that was about 5 years, that ride, and then the company did go public. It was before the internet, so going public wasn't as big a deal as it was after the internet, but it was still good to see, and it became part of IBM. The products are still part of IBM.
Really? I didn't know that. You said something really interesting. Going public is different with the internet than without. How? Obviously, I haven't experienced it, so What was the difference going public back then to now?
Well, it was mostly a function of money. Going public then, there were not the expectations of these amazing valuations. And so it was a much less big deal at the time. And the reporting was less. It was less difficult to go public. But you still became a public company. And so it was still a significant transition, just not the level. Really, the first company that defined the internet era IPO was Netscape. And that was my next company. But Netscape was the start of the new era. And of course, after Netscape, there were many, many IPOs that were in the internet era, of course, that were, but we're talking orders of magnitude bigger IPOs.
Considering our audience startup funding event, I really want to ask the beginning questions of the startup story that you had. So where did you find your investors? Why did you beg them to take over certain positions? What was leading up to that? And yeah, can you tell me that story, the beginning story?
Well, yeah, first of all, I have to apologize that we are literally talking 30 years ago. So
yeah, of course.
I'm trying to remember a lot of the details. At the time, the company had two brothers that were founders, but they were kind of, I forget what the situation was, but they basically wanted out. And so we needed, and I didn't want to be CEO, and I didn't feel qualified to be either. I felt like it was a pretty big reach to be a CTO and a head of product. And so I remember we had these two investors that I adored. They had founded one of the most successful companies in their industry, which was called Emulex Corporation was their company. And I just thought they were ideal. And I could tell that they didn't really want to retire. They had retired officially, but they didn't. They had lots more in them. They were still young at heart, and they were super wise. And so we were like, you should do this. You should take over. And it wasn't that hard to convince them. But, and they had, like I said, they had already put money into the company. It was more now just their time. But I think they really enjoyed it because they had built a big company and they wanted to see if they could build another company. And this was in software. And so, yeah, they were terrific, and that was luck. So much of a successful startup is luck. You probably know that it's luck. And that was lucky for sure. There were several really good people, some of which I knew and recruited with me, and other ones that I met at that startup. And, it was a good group of people and a significant problem. We were trying to help large software teams. There was not much to help large teams. Most of the things would help small teams. And so it was a problem that wasn't hard to get smart people to want to work on.
Yeah. You covered something really a common question that we get, which is what makes somebody a good CEO and what makes somebody a good CTO, which you actually were. What you said, you didn't feel qualified to be a CEO. You were barely feeling qualified as a CTO. What was going through your mind that you would say those things? What is a good CTO for you, and what is a good CEO for you?
Well, they're very different. I have published what I think makes a good CTO, and of course I've published what makes a good Chief Product Officer, CPO. And I felt, I had 10 years of experience in engineering and engineering management, and I had been taught it was called the HP way, sort of HP's way of scaling engineering. I felt like I never felt like I was like the best in the world at being a CTO, but I felt like I knew as much as most people that were doing it. So I didn't feel like a total imposter. But when it came to the CEO role, I I knew enough to know that I didn't know most of it. I knew I didn't know the level of finance you really need to know. And my network was not the venture capitalists that you would need to know. I had zero interest in fundraising. I would be happy to show a demo, and I went to all the VC fundraisers to show them the product and answer questions. But that's very different than working out the term sheets for the company. So I knew enough to know that there are lots of skills that I did not have. And I also knew enough to know there was probably a lot more that I didn't even know that I didn't know. So that was really, to me, the focus was we should get somebody here who can help us with that.
Yeah, makes sense. Could you elaborate more on the CTO role that you published? What were the main characteristics that you would tell our audience? A good CTO
well, I mean, look, the CTO is responsible for the engineers. First and foremost, has to recruit and coach a good team of engineers. They're also responsible for the architecture. You have to make sure you have an architecture in place that can support the needs of the company. You have to be the person that takes responsibility for technical debt and making sure you have a plan to keep that manageable as you go. You have to make sure you're making good bets on technology, which are the technologies that are relevant and which are the ones that are just fads. And so it's a very big and difficult job. No question about it.
What would you tell a young, newly recruited CTO as a top advice from, your career?
Well, I think I try to tell new young leaders of whether it's technology, design, or product, the same thing, which is you will be judged on how good your people are. In fact, you'll be judged on the worst of your people. So make sure that you make your top priority recruiting and coaching the right people for your teams. If you don't do that, it all falls apart.
Really? I didn't expect that. So you're telling me that a CTO should actually be almost like an HR professional, because they're going to be recruiting not most of their time, but that's going to be their main, most valuable job almost.
Yes, not almost. It is recruiting and developing. Now, I would never characterize that as HR. HR is never really able to do that. HR is much more about compliance, about things like salary administration and compliance. But yes, every good leader in the tech world needs to be a good recruiter and a good coach. There are lots of, I'm far from the only person who thinks that. Jeff Bezos has said multiple years that the single most important thing Amazon does well is recruit the right people. And so that, and Bill Campbell, who was known as the coach of Silicon Valley and literally coached Jeff Bezos, says, you cannot be a good manager without being a good coach. So that's the essence of the job. If you can't do that well, none of the other stuff matters. You could have the coolest strategy, you could have the greatest vision, it doesn't matter if you can't deliver.
Yeah. Didn't expect so many golden nuggets in the beginning of your career. So before we move on to the next stage of your career, I still wanted to ask about HP. You at one point said the HP way, a way of scaling. Could you elaborate on that? I'm obviously from Europe. I've never heard of this.
Well, and there's even a couple books that have been published on the HP way, because in the I was there in the 1980s, but the company did well in the 70s and the 60s. I mean, they were kind of the marquee company for a long time. And just like there are many books today about how Google works and how Amazon works, there were many books on how HP worked. And the founders of HP, Dave Packard and Bill Hewlett, shared a lot of their leadership principles. And they were way ahead of their time, in my opinion. You will find their leadership principles at the heart of most of the best tech companies today. And I was, again, just lucky that I got to learn in that environment. But it spread to Intel, it spread to Google, it spread to Amazon, it spread to Apple. So there were a lot of things they really did well. Most importantly, they were kind of the poster child for this concept of an empowered engineer. And I think that's probably, of all the things they did well, that's the thing that made them so successful for so long. And unfortunately, that's also the thing that they lost when they changed leadership direction, and that became much less important.
What is the concept of an empowered engineer? How does that translate into an organization?
Well, in most companies, unfortunately, I say this regretfully, but in most companies, the engineers are there to code what some executive tells them to code. That's what they're there for. In startups, it's usually some startup founder that says, "This is what I want." In fact, most of the time, that startup founder doesn't even hire engineers. Often they'll contract them. They'll use a firm, an agency, and they'll rent the engineers. And then, of course, they don't understand why this doesn't work. They don't understand why they don't get any innovation. And this is why. They just don't understand it, but this is why. The companies I've been talking about that are good would never do that, because they understand that the role of the engineer is not to just build the features that some executive or product manager wants. They understand their job is to solve hard problems. So you give them problems to solve rather than features to build. And an empowered engineer is able to figure out the best way to solve that problem. They know the technology better than anybody because they're working with the enabling technology every day. And as long as you provide them access to customers and access to real problems, they are the best, most consistent source of coming up with the truly innovative solutions.
So then the difference from your perspective between an agency or a contractor versus someone in-house working on your problems is that creativity where you can just say, this is the problem, go fix it. Whereas with a contractor or an agency, you just build features.
Yeah, I mean, it gets deeper than that. There's a great saying that actually comes from a famous venture capitalist in our industry, John Doerr, which is, we need teams of missionaries, not teams of mercenaries. And basically, if you hire an agency for your engineering, that is literally mercenaries, right? They are hired to build whatever you tell them. And usually they're there a few months. They are not, but like Bezos says, we need people to think like owners, not like employees. And I am gonna, you mentioned you're in Europe, and this is a common problem. I wanna be honest, this is a problem even in some companies in San Francisco, literally. But I find this especially common in Europe, where the mindset is a lot of people just think of themselves as an employee, not an owner. Now, of course, Bezos also says the easiest way to make sure your people feel like owners is to make them an owner. Give them stock, give them equity. And as you probably know, many startups, most startups in my experience in Europe, don't do that, which is one of the biggest mistakes in my opinion. Now, I realize that it's heavily impacted by the governments in Europe have different policies that make taxation difficult if you give some equity. But they don't realize what a tremendously high price they are paying for that policy. So, and I will also say stock ownership is not the only way to have your employees share in the profits. But it is really critical that your people, especially your engineers, not think of themselves as an employee. They shouldn't care. They need to feel like they own this.
Yeah. That is really valuable what you just said, and I feel like that's something you can only say if you actually have the experience and looking back at it. I have two questions on that from a practical point of view, especially what's happening in San Francisco. How much percentage do you give to an employee normally, asking as a young founder, looking at a new team that they're trying to hire, what's the kind of percentage average that people give? And the second thing is, how, if you feel like your team is acting like an employee, how do you turn them into an owner? Those other ways that you discussed that aren't stock options.
Yeah. Well, the first question is complicated because there's a lot of factors there. First of all, it depends on the role. Second of all, it depends on their seniority. Third of all, it depends on your maturity, your how far along the company is developed. Many people have published tables and guidelines on this. Benchmark Capital, the venture capital firm in particular, I thought had the best summary of, if it's an engineer with this much experience, it's this. But to set your expectations, it's not equal. So the founders are not getting, the founders get much more, obviously, much, much more. It's, and it's not even linear. But the thing is, it doesn't take much to make people feel like an owner. Even when I was at HP, and this was a company that was 20, 30 years old, it was already public. It was, I was given shares of stock. And of course, the idea was if you do well, the value of the company goes up, and that becomes. And even as a new engineer, by the end of the 10 years, my stock was worth roughly as much, I don't remember what the exact numbers were, but roughly as much as what my pay was over that time. So it doesn't take a large percentage. Usually for a public company, it's a fraction of 1%. It's a small, like 0.1 or 0.2% of, and that's of a startup. So it gets much smaller, of course, if a company is much bigger. So it doesn't take much for a company. And of course, there's also no guarantee. If the company doesn't do well, then those options are worthless. Those shares may be worthless. So it's a complicated question, but I strongly think that any founder should worry about this. And there's plenty of stuff online that can share with you the normal guidelines of what it takes. And then to the other question, like, what do you do if you can't do equity? The principle is this. You want to make it so that people feel like they have, well, we have a phrase, skin in the game, which just means that they are really in it. They're not just there to earn a paycheck, they show up at 9 and whatever, even work from home. It's not just a job. We want them to care about the company. And we also don't want them to care about succeeding at the expense of their colleagues. In other words, you don't want to set up, this is not like a sales organization, where in a sales organization, it's normal that some of the salespeople make a lot of money in commission and other ones make none. It's normal. In the tech product world, we want to make it so that you and I only benefit if we all benefit. So you want to make sure, and that one easy way to do that is to tie it to stock price, because stock price is one price, and if it goes up, we all benefit. If it doesn't go up, none of us benefit. So we like that. Another way this is done is profit sharing, where a percentage of the profits of the company are distributed to the employees. And normally, because what you want to do, and the main advantage of stock over profit sharing is you want to give people a reason to stay. And when you leave a company where you have equity and it's not vested means how much of that's been allocated to you is really yours now to monetize. And if it's a profit sharing, okay, the end of the quarter, we got our profit sharing check. We're happy. Now I'm going to leave. But you don't want them to want to leave. And if the idea of stock means if I leave, I'm leaving, 20% of this stock. Today, that would be worth this much money. If I stay, it's probably going to be worth even more. So that's called, there's also this notion of evergreening where you want to keep your employees always with more if they stay. Certainly the ones you want to stay. So this is a complicated topic, but for startups in the tech world, this is incredibly important. If you have good venture capitalists, they make sure you're doing this right because they know the best way their investment will be valuable is if the team is motivated and does the right things.
Just out of interest, as you were speaking about this, a question popped up in my head where I was thinking, is it possible that one guy or girl comes up with a technology that is so scalable that it's just this one person and just makes like a huge impact? Is that even possible, or is there always going to be a team?
Because of the way you phrased it, it's easy to answer. Yes, it's definitely possible. I've seen it.
Really? Have you seen it?
Oh, yeah. In fact, one of my, Google is huge company. And in general, it is a good company. They hire good people. They understand the importance of empowered teams, and they do great work. They have, I think, 8 services now with over 1 billion users each. That is awesome and super hard. But they have of all these thousands and thousands, I don't even know what the latest number is, how many engineers Google has, but I know it's a very large number. But they have a handful that are pretty extraordinary. And one of them, in fact, is credited with inventing the technology that has been key to them scaling to billions of users. So now he is a very well compensated person, even though he's an engineer. He's paid like a senior vice president. So Google is one of those companies that understands this notion of a dual career ladder. But yes, I know there are. Now that said, you asked, is it possible? It's possible. Is it common? No. Even he would say, his name's Jeff Dean, he would say that look, everything he did was part of a product team. And so it is common that in like most of the time, the products that are great products come from a team. And so we need different skill sets in order to make that happen.
Can I ask what he invented?
He's actually invented several things, but if you just Google his name, you will see several infrastructure components that he is famous for. Lately, he's been working on machine learning infrastructure. He loves infrastructure, and as do I, and I appreciate the value of that. Amazon actually has some people like that have been at the core of AWS for the same reasons.
Yeah, heard those stories. Super interesting. Let's go back to the story again. So now you're going through your startup. It went IPO. Did you leave right after, or what was the process of exiting your startup?
Yeah, I joined to join Netscape. That's why I left. Netscape I figured it was a once in a lifetime opportunity. Actually, the backstory there was one of the earliest developers at Netscape was a longtime friend of mine. We worked at HP Labs together. And when the company started, he tried to get me to come join him. And I wanted to, but we were right in the midst of, getting the startup to the point where it could really take off. And I'm like, I recruited this whole team. I can't leave. But I really wanted to, because I really wanted to be a part of that. But then about a year later, he was like, oh man, we are growing, it's going to be a rocket ship. Can you come now? And I'm like, yes, I can come now. And So I left then, and it was in good hands. The company was doing very well, and I felt like there were plenty of people that could do what I did. But I went to Netscape, and that was my favorite job ever. That was just an amazing experience.
Tell me more about Netscape and like the whole story, because Netscape, I think, got really big at one point.
Yeah, it was the fastest company to $1 billion at the time of revenue, but it was a wild ride also. What made it so great was there were, what I would say, two things made it great for me. Everybody has their own experience. What made it great was the people. It attracted people that saw that this was going to be the future and wanted to help. And
maybe for the listeners, could you quickly explain what Netscape did exactly?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Well, Netscape was Netscape Communications Corporation. It was co-founded by Mark Andreessen. Many of you know Mark Andreessen. He's gone on to become a very successful venture capitalist. And Jim Clark, who was a serial entrepreneur. He had founded Silicon Graphics, which was a very successful company at the time. And the two of them started Netscape as the original internet company. It was based on the browser that Mark Andreessen created when he was at University of Illinois. It was called Mosaic, and they wanted to productize this, turn it in from a school project basically into a product. And of course, it went on to become the fastest growing product of its time. And then, of course, it wasn't just the browser, but there were servers. Netscape did one of the first web servers, one of the first streaming services for media, for mail servers. The whole internet needed an infrastructure. And Netscape was really created to provide that. Now, they recruited all kinds of people that were very passionate about that. One of them actually became Mark Andreessen's co-founder at both LoudCloud and Andreessen Horowitz, which is Ben Horowitz. Ben was responsible for one of the servers. I worked for Mark Andreessen, and Ben did too, but Ben worked on one of the real money-making parts. And Ben was one of the smartest product leaders I have ever met. And imagine a company where there are 50 people like Ben and Mark, just very passionate and smart about these areas. So for me, it was a great place to learn, number one, just because I was learning from so many great people. They brought in a CEO, Jim Barksdale, who I thought was the best CEO I've ever seen in my life. I loved working for him. He was just a terrific leader. But the second thing was Netscape, because it was really the original internet company, it was forced to not only build a lot of products, but it was forced to figure out how the way we build products needs to change for the internet era. So a lot of the concepts we refer to today, like minimum viable product, like continuous delivery, these concepts were born at Netscape out of necessity. It had to change. The old way of doing things, which honestly we referred to as the Microsoft way, they were really the thought leaders in how it was done before the internet, was not working in the internet era. Things had to move much faster. We had different forms of distribution. It was just a different world. And so we were having to figure out what didn't work and then how to change things so that it would work. And that was, for somebody like me that likes studying both tools and the methods we use, that was like a dream job. And my particular job was to be responsible for the platform and tools because, well, you already heard how much I like platform. But Mark Andreessen's view was that thousands and thousands of companies, even then, were coming to Netscape and saying, how can we take advantage of the internet? But The problem was they didn't have the standard tools and services that Microsoft would be able to provide for the client server world. So we had to quickly create them. Things like JavaScript, things like SSL, things like Flash, which actually came from Adobe, and Java, which came from Sun, things like that. Had to be put together. And so my job was to put together a platform for the internet. And some of that came from us, and some of that came from third parties.
So it gave you exposure.
Yeah, it gave me exposure to large companies and startups all over the world. And that was a great experience to learn about them.
So the question that pops up for me, which is a fascinating story when you enter Netscape, how big was Netscape when you enter it? And what were the biggest learning lessons you said that you learned from Ben Horowitz as a product, within products, and that CEO that you said was one of the best CEOs you've ever met?
Yeah, well, it would be hours to go through, I think, all of the things I learned there. I really did learn a lot.
Maybe the most relevant learning points for startups or something?
No, so much. It's almost where to start. Because, I mean, I felt like I had a good foundation when I went there, but that was all in the Microsoft era. And so it was more about learning how to really take advantage of what's different in the internet era. And because we were on the front lines of that, we were exposed to the learnings, and not just from us, but from companies we were working closely with. Like early Yahoo actually hosted at Netscape because there was no other place that could handle that amount of traffic. And I was able to learn by watching what they were learning as well. And I ended up helping them a little bit. And it was just a great experience. A couple years later, Google was one of those companies. And so this was, it's just hard to replicate. So as far as lessons, I would, one of the things that had huge implications was in the Microsoft era, we would focus on these big bang products where we would work for a year and test the hell out of it and then release a product. In the internet era, we realized that was not only was that not very good, but we had an alternative now. We could release much smaller increments much more frequently, and we could collect analytics on all of it. I mean, we didn't call it cloud computing back then. That was pre-term, but that's what was happening. We had services running in the cloud and that everybody was using. We were getting thousands and quickly millions of users almost instantly. And so we realized that should change how we develop product. And that could make us much better than we were ever able to do before. And that's a pretty fundamental change in thinking, in mindset, and in techniques. So I would say that had many implications. And other things we learned was handling very rapid growth. It was the first, it certainly wasn't the last company to grow like crazy. Facebook grew like crazy, Slack grew like crazy, Salesforce, lots of companies have, Amazon has, but it was probably the first to deal with this kind of rapid growth and what you need to do to handle recruiting of that many people, what you need to do to coach and develop that many people. It's not that hard to have a startup doing one product that makes sense. It's hard to have 100 product teams working on different elements of that product and have it all make sense. So these were whole dimensions of things we learned as well. Yeah, it's hard to.
So how do you deal with hypergrowth, and what are some practical tactics that if somebody's experiencing hypergrowth now, you would be sharing with this person?
Well, first of all, I always tell them it's a very good problem to have, right? You only have this problem if you've done something really well. It usually means you've achieved product market fit in a pretty substantial way. So that is a good problem to have. But it's also true that it kills a lot of companies. We call it surviving success. They don't always survive that success. So it really takes, this is one of those things where when you're small, the leadership role is actually pretty easy. But when you grow, the leadership role becomes disproportionately important and complicated because you have a lot of dots to connect, a lot of pieces in the puzzle. And you have to make sure that everybody has the context that's necessary to help them make good decisions.
Okay, so back to the Netscape days, you clearly, that company was the first experiencing all of that. What did that mean for the leadership and the culture inside the company? Was everybody under pressure? Was burnout a real thing? Or was the leadership really good in navigating that? And if yes, what did they do?
Well, I need to give a caveat to this because I made a lot of friends during the time at Netscape that I still, we had our 20th 20-year reunion about 4 or 5 years ago. Now it's been 25 years. So I've been in touch with a lot of friends about this. And one of the things I've realized is that that kind of rapid growth experience impacted each of us differently. So I loved it, and everybody who knows me knows I loved it. I think I loved pretty much every minute of it. I learned so much. I got to work on so many different areas. I got to meet so many amazing companies and founders of those companies. So I loved it, but some of my colleagues were so burnt out. Some of them really burnt out because the work was intense. The company was a very intense ride. And when Microsoft decided to get serious about competing with Netscape, and then they decided to do it by making their product free, which eventually they were found guilty of antitrust violations by doing that. But at the time, who knew? And the point is that made it really high pressure because Microsoft had so much money and so many people, and they could afford to give it away for free. We couldn't afford to give it away for free because that was our revenue. But very quickly, that $1 billion of revenue disappeared because Microsoft gave it the alternative away for free. So we had to very quickly ramp up sales of our server products, which actually did happen amazingly fast, but not really fast enough. And so there was a lot of stress. I just enjoyed it more maybe than others, but a lot of people I think were stressed. Almost everybody I know loved it, but they were more burnt out maybe than I was. And I think that's a little bit the luck of the draw. It depends on who you work for and whether or not, how much pressure your particular area of the company has. But there were a lot, anybody that really worked there then was exposed to a lot of amazing things.
Just to get a little bit of context, you entered the company. How many employees did Netscape have, and when did you leave? How many employees did they have?
Yes. Well, I left after we lost the browser wars, and the company was basically sold to AOL. But when I joined, I'm trying to remember what number I had, but there were like a couple hundred people. So it was not early. I should have joined when my friend first told me about it. That would have been a much smarter time to join, but I didn't feel like I could. But anyway, there were a few hundred people, maybe 200 or 300 people. So it was a company for sure. And when I left, there were thousands. I don't remember how many thousands, but it was a big company by then. What I considered a big company with several divisions. But when America Online bought the company, what they actually did was they split the company, and part of it was sold to Sun Microsystems and part of it was sold to AOL. I was with the part that went to AOL, and AOL, there were some people there I really liked, but AOL was a different kind of business and not really the kind I was interested in. And I had met at Netscape the co-founder of eBay, Pierre Omidyar, and I really liked him, and I liked his vision. And so when that happened, I joined them as their original head of product and design.
So you were the first head of product and design for eBay?
Yes, but at the time it was pretty small, so they had engineers. They didn't really have, that's why I joined, was they wanted to build up their product management and user experience designs competencies for their organization. So to be honest, almost the main thing I did there was recruit.
So how old was eBay and how many employees did it have when you joined?
I'm not sure I remember how many employees, but it was a couple years old. And eBay was making money from the very beginning, so it was already a real business. But in truth, the real original head of product was Pierre. He's the one who envisioned the product and had that vision for what it became. And I really liked him, and I liked learning that. I thought it was a great vision, the idea that you'd have one marketplace that you could buy, sell to anybody in the world. I thought that was an amazing vision, something you couldn't do before the internet. So I don't remember how many employees there were before, but...
Was it more than 100 or?
It was in the hundreds for sure. I don't remember, but they had just gone public and were struggling with scale.
Well, what does that mean, struggling with scale, and how did you help fix that?
Well, struggling with scale for them meant keeping the site running because there were so many people trying to use it. And they almost went out of business, actually, because of that. They lost about 30% of their market value because do you remember when Twitter was getting ready to go public and everybody was seeing the fail whale and didn't know if Twitter would survive? Twitter did survive, and eBay survived too, but both of them barely survived.
What do you think about eBay if you compare it to your days to eBay now?
Oh, I mean, this is very different today. It's now 20 years later. Although a friend of mine who was there when I was there, Jamie Iannone, is now the CEO of eBay, which I think is a good thing. So I'm hoping that you have to realize when I was there, or when the early eBay was twice the size of Amazon. Twice the size. Today, Amazon is 100 times the size of eBay? So eBay grew a little bit, maybe, but Amazon grew like this. Now, so I've always felt that eBay had much potential beyond what they did. And I think Jamie will hopefully give it a new life again.
If I look back at eBay, a while ago to eBay now, I feel like eBay had a shot to be almost like Amazon now. Am I wrong to think that way?
No, I felt that too. But this is the difference, honestly, in leadership. Amazon had the best leader in our industry. And that's hard to compete against.
So can you quickly just shine a light about what you were exactly doing throughout your years at eBay? You said mostly recruiting.
Oh, mostly recruiting. Just because there was so little, there was almost nothing in an organization there when I joined. And so had to build out, had to hire a lot of people. If anybody's worked in a company that's going through very rapid growth, it is very tiring, all the recruiting, interviewing, job screening, reference calls you need to do to hire large numbers of people. And then, of course, you're promoting people into management and coaching them on management. It's just a lot of people development when you're growing that fast. And there was also some cool product stuff, but most of my memories from the time are a lot of recruiting.
That's super interesting what you just covered. So you were doing mostly, all these recruitment tasks and management coaching you mentioned. Can we first discuss that first part? What are the main things you learned that you have to do if you're recruiting people? You mentioned reference checks. That's the first time I heard that. Could you maybe go deeper into other super specific things you definitely need to do?
Well, look, this is a topic in the difference between how good companies staff their positions and how most companies do. Like you made a reference before to HR. In bad companies, that's what happens. HR is responsible for recruiting people and reviewing resumes. But just ask yourself, I know in Europe you love football. Can you imagine a football coach trying to build a team depending on HR to find players?
No.
No, it's ridiculous. And of course, as a coach, you have very specific needs for each position. You want very specific people. So you don't just wait for them to walk onto your field and say, how about me? You go out and you recruit them. And that's what every good leader I know does. They go out and recruit. And so that's what I was doing. There were lots of positions that needed to be filled, and I needed to go out and find those people. Now, part of that means giving community talks and meeting more people and a lot of coffees with people that are interested, and you're trying to understand what they've done and what they're good at. And you're trying to decide, would they be the right person for this role? And then once you do believe you have somebody that's the right person, you have to persuade them that this would be a really good step in their career. And so that's a whole process of convincing somebody. Now, a reference check is one of the steps we do is to talk to people that have worked for that person before to see if they're what we think. What was it like to work with them? What was it like when they had conflict? What was the time, what was an example where it was a really hard situation, difficult situation? How did they handle it? That's called a reference check. And we do everything we can to try to make sure that the person is going to really add value to the team and have a great, that years later they will say that was a great place for me to work.
Any other practical ones for recruitment?
Well, there are many. This is a whole section, and I wrote a book recently called Empowered. And one of the biggest sections is coaching and staffing. In fact, that is the biggest section, coaching and staffing. And there are many, many chapters on recruiting, on onboarding, on finding the right people, what to look for, what not to look for, and then most importantly, how to coach them to become strong. This is a huge topic, though.
Yeah, that was the second question I had, which is maybe very shortly, if you have the time, to cover how you actually find potential in people that could be good managers, and then maybe what's the process to make them become a manager.
Well, most people are promoted to first level management because they're very good at what they do. They might be a very good engineer, so we promote them to manager of engineers. Very good designer, same thing. And that there's value in that because they're going to be coaching those people to also be good designers and good engineers. So that's important. But the hardest thing for most new managers is to realize that their product is no longer their product. Their product is now these people. It's their team. And so it requires a very significant change in how they spend their time and how they work, especially if they want to be a good manager and not a micromanager. So this is the kind of thing we spend time coaching and developing the managers.
Is that something, maybe nature-nurture debate, is that something that somebody needs to have, or is that something that you can teach? So are you pretty much looking for people that have that skill and then nurturing that skill, or are you looking for anybody who's really good and then just teaching that person?
For the most part, we are taking somebody who's got good competencies and we are teaching them the art of management most of the time. Yeah, it doesn't mean that some people obviously are better. We say they have a higher EQ. They are better at interacting with people, but no, I mean, you asked that. I have in the past, I have met some companies where they have terrible managers, and I would ask their leaders, why would you have that person as a manager? And I have literally been told that we made that person a manager because he couldn't do the actual job.
Whoa.
And I'm like, that was the dumbest thing you could possibly do. You took somebody that couldn't be a developer and made them in charge of recruiting and developing other developers.
That's horrible.
But they did that because they're too much of a coward to fix the hiring issue. So no, that is not what we do. We take someone who understands the skills and competencies and teaches them, and we teach them how to be a manager. Just like, by the way, a lot of good venture capitalists, a lot of good executive coach will take somebody who was a good CTO or was a good chief product officer and will coach them to be a CEO.
Yeah. I love the level of honesty. I think it really brings a ton of value for our listeners, especially for me. So a question that I had is, you're teaching people to become managers. And obviously you've experienced people with MBAs taking over leadership. What is your opinion on somebody who wants to become a manager and sending them to do an MBA to become this manager? Do you find any value in those MBAs or not?
In general, no. There's a couple exceptions. I mean, so first of all, I would separate the value of an MBA from the skills you learn in MBA programs. You're not going to learn a lot of skills that I have seen that are going to help you, unfortunately. However, if you can get into one of the world's best MBA programs, like a Stanford GSB or Harvard MBA, that has other value that will probably be worthwhile. So I'm not suggesting you're going to learn skills there that are necessarily, but I am suggesting you will make relationships that will help you, and you will learn other things that are less tangible that will help. But no, those programs almost never teach the things that we need to coach leaders on in product and technology and design leadership roles. You'll typically do much better career-wise to spend the time learning those areas.
So in your opinion, if you would actually go to, an undergraduate or a graduate degree, you'd almost do two parallel degrees, where MBA would be like your extra degree you're doing, and then you'd be focusing on, for instance, computer science or something.
I wouldn't even bother with the MBA normally. So I was trying to say, I do think computer science is an excellent degree. There's several great design programs that are great if you're looking for a career in tech. The truth is, a lot of people have very unusual degrees and they've become excellent. And also, an increasing number of people have no degrees and they're excellent. So it's really not, when we talk about building technology-powered products, it's really not about the academic side. I am looking for people that are very hungry to learn everything. They want to learn about everything and they want to apply what they learn and solve problems for customers. I'm looking for that much more than there are, like, I do think academically there are 3 classes that are useful. One is they should take some programming language class if they haven't ever done that. A second is they should take some data analysts or data analytics or data science class. That's very valuable. And the third is some finance class. So, but you don't need degrees for that. You just need a class.
Yeah. You've been at eBay now pretty long, right?
eBay. I left eBay 20 years ago.
Sir, yeah, you were at eBay.
No, I was only at eBay a couple of years. It was an intense couple of years, but it was early in the time. I left when did I leave? 2001 or 2, something like that.
Okay, so it was like 2-3 years. Okay.
Yeah.
And so why did you leave, and what were the next steps?
Well, I wanted to do what I'm doing now. I wanted to really work with startups, and I wanted to work on writing and sharing a lot of the things I've learned. And so as soon as I could like financially do that, and eBay, I was there at a good time at eBay, so their stock appreciated a lot. And I was at Netscape, which is a great place. So I felt like I was in a good spot in my life to be able to try doing working more with the startup community.
So what did that look like? Obviously, you're leaving eBay at quite a senior position. I mean, was it really like, okay, I'm done, I have enough money, I don't have to worry, let me just go to startups? Or was there really like a gradual thinking that led to, I feel like I want to learn more, I'm not learning more on the corporate side, I want to go to the startup side? Like what was the thought process?
Well, no, I had done startups and big companies, and some companies from small to large. So it wasn't that. I felt like, first of all, I really enjoyed the startup phase best. And once companies get bigger, there are less of what I love to do. And eBay was definitely getting bigger. And so, no, I had more fun doing the startup and growth stage stuff. So there was that. I also really felt like I had learned a lot because I was lucky to be in these companies at the right time. And I wanted to write more about what I had learned. So, so the timing felt good to do that.
So then, since then, could you maybe elaborate more about what you've done, what you've launched, which startups you've worked with, maybe something interesting?
Well, that's the thing. Because I was the timing was perfect, because most of the companies in Silicon Valley, you can trace it to early employees either at Netscape or at eBay. And maybe if you extend that to PayPal, which I had met early PayPal founders at Netscape, and then they, of course, became part of eBay.
Who did you meet?
Luke Nosek worked for me actually at Netscape, and he was one of the early founders at PayPal. And so I had sort of seen PayPal early on, loved PayPal. And in fact, I was a guy at eBay pushing to acquire PayPal. So I thought it was a great acquisition. But the point was, between those companies, people went, like the early people at Amazon and Google were at Netscape. And then, on Facebook and Salesforce.com and all these companies sort of the era, So the point was I knew a lot of these people, and they would often contact me about the stuff we had done at either Netscape or eBay and wanted me to share those things. So because of that, I still, most of my work is with friends. That now a lot of these people have started companies, or they're, heads of technology or heads of product all around the industry. And it's far beyond Silicon Valley today, but that's really where it came from. So I didn't really have to work very hard to find companies to work with. And I have literally worked with hundreds of companies. Not every one that I wish I could, but most of the ones I wish I could. So that's just the advantage of having been able to know these people at the right time. That's luck, again, pure luck.
I looked into some of your books as well, and what I really loved about one of them, I think it's called Inspired, was you really look from your perspective at a lot of these tech companies that just pretty much dominated the world. I'd love to hear your opinion on why you think Silicon Valley pretty much became, the epicenter of pretty much everything that we're using. I mean, I'm on a Mac right now. Like everything that we use, or most of the things that we use, I would say, somehow originated in that little valley or like San Francisco area. Why is that?
Yeah, I know a lot of people speculate about it, and I would, so much came from Seattle as well, and today you'd have to include New York and London. There's a lot of the things we depend on every day. It's not just Silicon Valley anymore, but I do think a lot started there, no question. And if I had to pick one thing, it would be because, in my opinion, the roots go down to really Dave Packard and Bill Hewlett. And again, you can trace early Apple to there. So I really think they get a lot of credit for planting the seeds. And if you look at all the things, all the leadership principles they did, to me, the most important principle is this idea of an empowered engineer. And to this day, that's the biggest difference I find between great tech product companies and the rest. So for example, in Europe, in Stockholm, Spotify has done such a great job. And it's fair to point out, Spotify competes with two of the very best companies in the world, with Apple Music and with Amazon Music. And they have not only competed, but they've held their own. They've done fantastic. And I've spent lots of visits at Spotify, and they're also in New York. But Spotify, it's really about great engineers and empowering those engineers. And I would argue that's the key. That's why they've been able to do so much. And that's true in all the good companies I know.
Yeah, so it pretty much comes down to those two people, Hewlett Packard, and then them setting the groundwork that originated all these amazing companies.
Yeah, I don't think they would there were others like Andy Grove at Intel was amazing, and of course there were people before that generation as well, but now we're getting to before I know those people. But yeah, and Bill Gates, obviously, I think he was fabulous for the industry and really made a major mark on the world. And of course, Steve Jobs, and you look at Elon Musk today, he's in the same mold for sure. So, yeah, that combination of entrepreneurship and empowering engineers is a very powerful combination.
So that's something I actually wanted to ask regarding like the new generation of companies, I would call, like the Elon Musk types and Teslas and everything. And Spotify's, do you think that they're doing now something much, much better, that they've built on that groundwork and have become much, much better at this hypergrowth or empowered engineer culture? If you're observing them, what do you think are they doing good and bad, I guess, is the question.
Well, I don't think they're doing well. So I include them in that. Those are great examples of great product companies that are built on this idea of empowered product teams. And they are illustrations of what you can do with ordinary people if you give them the space to really do what they've been trained to do. So to me, that's the difference. Obviously, Tesla has the kinds of innovations they have done are amazing, especially if you want to include SpaceX in that. The kinds of innovations they have done. But fundamentally, are they a different kind of company? I don't think so. I mean, I do think every company is different. Like Netflix has got a very different culture than Apple and a very different culture than Amazon. But all three of them have empowered engineers at their core and these same sort of management principles. So for example, Netflix has a mantra, which is lead with context, not control. It's the same point. Don't micromanage, don't command and control. Give your people the context, let them make the decisions. So to me, that's what's really going on. You're just seeing more examples of what an empowered team can do.
Yeah, makes sense. So what are you doing nowadays? It's been a while since you've been at eBay. You're very much focused on these startups. Can I ask what you're doing nowadays?
Well, like I said, I've been doing the same thing since I left eBay. So I started Silicon Valley Product Group in something like 2003, I think, and I have been doing it ever since. So I started it when I left eBay, and then it has grown. We don't want to grow big. We're only 6 people. And we're all heads of product, former heads of product. And so I'm still doing what I just described to you. I left eBay to do.
Nice. Do you feel like at one point you're going to have enough? As I'm having this conversation with you, I feel like I'm learning that your main goal in life is to be a lifelong learner, to keep learning. That's what excites you. Do you feel at one point you're going to have to, or not going to have to, you're going to want to quit and just say enough is enough? I just want to, sit on a couch and watch Netflix or something.
Well, I think I can't imagine that, just because I love what I do, truly. And so I hope every year I tell my partners, and they say the same thing. We hope we can keep doing this another year. So who knows what the future holds, but I hope it's more of this.
Maybe for myself and the listeners also, what is it exactly that you do nowadays? Like a startup calls you up. Obviously, we understand your background, everything you've done, but what are common things you actually do?
Yeah, well, and I should have. The straightforward answer for you is you can see what I do at svpg.com. That's our website. It describes exactly what we do, the different kinds of things. So it's a mix of advising and coaching startups and growth stage companies. My partners, some of them also help bigger companies, but I focus on the smaller and the growth stage companies. And I also do some teaching, which I have done again for a long time. Even with my teams at Netscape and eBay, I would, like I said, there isn't much. You don't learn this stuff in an MBA program. So I have informally put together curriculum, which is only, it takes a week. But I still do occasional teaching. That moved online with the pandemic, but it's worked out quite well online. And I do a little bit of investing with the companies that I advise. If I like them, I'm often invited to participate. So it's a combination. And then, of course, I write as well. I've written 2 books, and and I publish a blog, which is really about sharing the lessons that I've learned.
The blog is on Medium or on your own website?
No, everything's on svpg.com.
Yeah. I absolutely loved our conversation. There were so many golden nuggets. I'd love to roll out the red carpet for you, and please, I don't know if you have anything to promote, some startups to promote. Please tell the people where they can find you or how they can get in touch with you.
Well, again, the website is svpg.com, and you'll find my email there. You'll find 1,000, I don't know how many, probably about 1,000 articles today, because I've been writing for so many years and blogging about this. Anything, always related to product, always for free, wide open. So help yourself. And you can also read about my partners. They all specialize in different areas, and we're all focused on product and leadership. So, yeah, that's the place to look. You'll also see the 2 books if you're interested, and yeah, hopefully that's helpful.
Quickly for the people, what does each book cover, and what was your focus within each book?
Well, Inspired.
I read some parts of them, and they're quite different.
Yeah.
And so I'd love to hear from you.
Well, this is Inspired. Inspired is for product teams, product managers, designers, and engineers. This was written to help teams learn how the teams at the best companies discover solutions that are valuable, usable, feasible, viable. That's basically what product teams do. Empowered was written for the leaders of those companies so that they could learn the best practices of the leaders at the best companies on how to do things like product vision, product strategy, team topology, assign work to teams, manage those teams, hiring, coaching. We talked about a lot of those concepts today. So Empowered is for leaders and managers, and Inspired is for product managers, designers, and engineers.
Yeah, makes sense. So yeah, any last words if you look at your entire career, young startups, any last words to our audience?
Well, I mean, you have to love technology and love products, but if you do, is definitely a great career, and I think it's a better time than ever to get involved in it. So it's a terrific time to start a company, and just as long as you be smart about how you do it, don't make the mistakes that so many make. Give yourself the best chance of success you can, and I wish you the best of luck.
One question to that though is, don't you feel like the bubble has been gone? How come you're saying like this is the best time? Do you still feel like that? Because I feel almost like the bubble is bursting, just like the internet boom.
Well, bubble is a different question, really. Bubble is really about valuations. And already the bubble has lasted way longer than I thought it would, the current valuation bubble. I am terrible at predicting when that's going to happen. And of course, if every day I say the bubble's going to burst, one day I'll be right. So who knows? But I have never been into it for the short term. For me, it's a long-term thing. And so do I think it's a great time to start a company? Absolutely. It's a great time. So the real question to me is, are there great opportunities out there? And you have to realize there have never been more people in the world connected online than there is today. Never. So the market is bigger than ever before. There has never been as many enabling technologies. And the price, the infrastructure required to start a company has never been so available, accessible, and inexpensive. So those are some pretty good ingredients for a company. What it requires is a team that knows what they're doing, that has some worthy goal, some problem that they really want to solve, some way they want to make the world better, and like I said, the skills that know how to tackle that.
I love that. And on those words, I think we're wrapping it up. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
All right. Thanks for having me. Good luck.
If you liked this episode, you can check out our most recent one here. And if you haven't already, make sure you click here to subscribe and see the next one. But if you're interested in more tips and tricks, then make sure to join our Facebook group where you can find thousands of like-minded people and you get direct access and support to any business question from the entire startup funding event team.